Mm.
So you can have, so we'll be able to hopefully be back in business next week for the next 3 if you want to. I know that it's kind of scary to probably be around someone who's had COVID, and I respect that. So always do what you're comfortable with. But just remember, I now have more superpowers than I did when I started. So I'm super boosted with all the natural antibodies of having had COVID. Anyway, all that to say, breakthrough cases are a real thing. Daniel and I are fully vaccinated, and we are very, very careful. And yet, it came in, and Daniel was probably hit the hardest of the 4 of the 6 of us that were hit. And we're just very grateful that Liza, who is not vaccinated due to her age, actually was hit the least. She had a sniffle, and then it went away, and then she had nothing for 10 days. So I will, as a mom, and I know Daniel would agree, as a dad, as a parents, we were grateful that we got the brunt of it. Being bigger and stronger, we knew that that was probably the better thing. So we're just really grateful. So, but I'm super grateful also to be here tonight to talk with you guys. And we've got some fun things planned. So one thing that we're going to do at the outset, I'm going to do a little review because I always like to, I know that it is good for all brains to do a little review. Like, what did we talk about last time? But we'll do that. And then last minute, not really last minute, I think John Mark and I may have known about this for a couple of weeks. So John Mark's one of my regular interlocutors. So that means on a day to day basis, John Mark is in a group where I will engage theologically and philosophically. So for years, John Mark and I have known each other for about 5, 6 years. And John Mark has always been someone that I have bounced ideas off of, and vice versa. At least I think I can say that, John
Yeah,
Mark.
for sure.
When I was talking about this class, he started talking to me about a scholar and theologian and political activist to some degree, Paul Tillich. And John Mark was explaining to me Paul Tillich and Paul Tillich's understanding of the ultimate concern and how that relates to religion. And I thought, you know what? This sounds so interesting to me. Why not talk about Paul Tillich? To which John Mark said, that would be a great idea. Then John Mark sent me some notes, and I said, oh, no, 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 no. I want you to talk about Paul Tillich. And because I love sharing the stage and I love giving other teachers an opportunity to stretch legs and practice their own gifts. And I also didn't want to deprive you of a good teaching on Paul Tillich and ultimate concern and how that relates to religion. I figured John Mark would be the best person to do that. And he agreed. So after we do a little bit of a review, what I'm going to do is I'll hand it over to him for about 20 minutes, and then we'll just get a kind of like a nice little splash in the kiddie pool of Paul Tillich, and then we'll move into a discussion about what I like to call barkeep. I'll have a toxic and tonic on the rocks, which is my way of talking about the good and the bad of religion, okay, for society and human people. So, with that brief overlay of what's going to be happening today, why don't we just talk about briefly what did we talk about last time? Do you remember just any basic concept that comes out of last time?
Let's we talked about how you control people.
Yeah, yeah. And where did that discussion lead?
About knowledge and translation.
Yes, that discussion leaned on pre-understanding from the previous time, and then we moved into talking about God, and God is not what? We can't say God is, it's a number. usually start.
Oh, monotheism versus polytheism. Yeah.
Okay. When we're looking at, so remember last time we really pressed hard and overlaid a lot with the idea of, I wish this thing was not dropping down as I spoke. One of the we pressed into, and one thing that I like to really highlight as I'm doing this kind of few weeks, is that we have pre-understanding. We have been taught a certain amount of things. We have been given a lens. We have been submerged into the marinating liquid of our environment. So we're American, we're in the West, we're Christian principally. Even though there might be different herbs in that marinade is pretty the same for all of us. And that whole thing starts to color, it starts to create different dynamics and different ideas of what's going on. Oh yeah, that's way better. Okay, what's going on with how we see things. So we have a pre-understanding. Not to mention, adding into this discussion of pre-understanding, we've got genetic makeup. We've got school degrees behind us. We've got the way that our family of origin was hardwired. All of these things start to impact what it means to have pre-understanding and how our pre-understanding is defined. Okay, so with the idea of moving from that that idea of like if you wanted to be an evil dictator, you would control people's understandings. You would want to limit how much of their pre-understanding could possibly be changed, because knowledge is power. We then talked about how our conception of God is influenced by our pre-understanding. And so we can't say all God is one. Remember when I laid out all the texts and I was like, if you're going to tell me that you understand what all religion is about, you need to have also simultaneously read all these different things and studied all the basic ins and outs of all religion in order to look at me and say, oh, I don't taught anything because I already know everything. Okay? And so that's something that's really important, is that our pre-understanding really can, not all, our pre-understanding can resist new information, because new information demands that we change. New information means that we must confess that we were wrong somewhere. Okay, and so that's why when we come into contact with someone telling us who they are, or another tradition telling us who it is or what it is, we have to first confess that we held onto an idea that has been deconstructed, and now we are going to receive this new information in order to construct. Okay, in order for this tradition to construct themselves for us, rather than us imposing our pre-understanding on them, which is actually pretty violent. Remember, what Lisa Jr. What was it that Homer called her? Lisa Jr. Right? We don't want to do that. Our pre-understanding looks at a little girl that's wearing the same thing that's like our daughter, and we say Lisa Jr. That's pre-understanding in operation. So one thing that we talked about last time was God is not one. Because when we say God is one, we are going to take all those beautiful, vibrant, colorful, vivacious traditions and flush them all into one that is under our pre-understanding of our God. Remember the first day when we did our little exercise with let's talk about what religion is? Eventually it started to come out. We were actually defining our own religion, ultimately. So all of this to say that, one, we are human beings that are given a lot of choices in life, and we are also given a lot of things, okay? And our process as what I would say vibrant Christians trying to really wrestle with the world and Christianity's history, which is a mix of the bad and the good, which is where we're going today, we want to always be posturing ourselves to be more open for not only other traditions to tell us what they believe or what they think but also ultimately human beings. Okay, and that's really sort of our ultimate goal when we're talking about what is religion. We want to get to a point where we're comfortable with saying, I know what I believe, I know what I know what my religion's about. Would you tell me about yours? And actually sitting and listening. And that's kind of where we ended last time, was talking about the risk of not just asking the question, but then also sitting in the silence and letting someone else tell us the answer. Okay, because there's two different ways of asking a question. You can ask a question and then immediately answer it for yourself, or you can ask a question and wait for the answer. So anyway, that's where we kind of have been broadly. So with that, I'm going to give you, I just want to locate, oh wait, any questions about what we talked about before?
Yeah,
Okay,
Ralph. I call your attention to Joel M. Hoffman.
okay,
He's the PhD in Hebrew linguistics. And he has a number of books out, including The Bible's Cutting Room Floor. And he talks about the extreme difficulty of trying to translate ancient Hebrew into anything that we recognize. And when you talk about our religion, I read two of these books. One was fairly deep and the other was fairly okay. But it's very clear we have no concept of Israel or Judea in the period of 1500 BC up to the time of Jesus.
right.
And the whole context of the Old Testament and what we have received is basically built on quicksand.
It is. It's such a good point. So one of the things that I love about that point that you made is when we, like the era right before we get the actual scrolls that have been preserved that make up the Tanakh and then also form the First Testament of the Christian Bible, there is a period where Israel is in the land and then they get handed over to the king of Babylon. King of Babylon. And then Israel gets taken out of the lands, okay? And then they're over here. But they really want to be over in the land here, but they're over here. But it's like 150 years go by before the king of Persia comes in and says, I'm going to release you, Israelites, and you can go back to your land. And you know what happens? Half the Israelites are like, we good. And they stay. The other half says, hey, let's go build a temple. And then they go and they build a temple. And then the prophets come in and they're writing down everything. You know what the prophets did? They chose the stories that mirrored that story of in the land, out of the land, back to the land. It would be interesting to have some of the stories that were not chosen. And that's what I love about what you just shared, Ralph, because it is so important to understand that for centuries and centuries and centuries, Israel lived with verbal, oral stories, and there was a lot of them. And the ones that we have are crafted from a very narrow perspective of what God was doing with this set. And so that whole theme of exile and return gets really set up on a nice pedestal in the first 5 books of Moses, because those are the stories that resonated with the people who were leaving Babylon and heading back to build Second Temple.
Do we not have a Hebrew or Jewish apocrypha?
Well, yes, but the language in that apocrypha is basically somewhere around 400 AD when the Romans and the Greeks picked it up. The thing that I liked about what Hoffman has to say is so much of that ancient Hebrew language has to be inferred in context. Yeah. And even then we can't know for sure. I mean, such little words, is what does it mean where there is a woman coming to a man?
Yeah.
What is the context of that? You've got adultery, you've got murder, you've got all these other things that we've projected back into the Old Testament. that may not have the same meaning of the context of the Israeli people, the Jewish people at that time.
Yeah, it's
And-
really, it's such a good point to bring up because we need to be so gentle with the text that we have and not make such hard and fast rules like we like to do. We can even make the same arguments with the Greek just because there's so much that's lost in translation. But holding with this thought, which is super, super great, I want to just briefly jump into introducing Paul Tillich. I'm just going to locate him in history. So Paul Tillich is, if you're familiar with Germany, let's say late 19th century, early 20th century, like your priest is, then you know where Paul Tillich falls in regards to the whole history of human beings who are writing during World War I and even on the rise of as Hitler's acquiring more and more power. Paul Tillich is one of those people. So on the spectrum of sort of the big names of Weimar Germany and early 20th century Protestant thought of Germany, it would be like you'd have all the way, the most politically active name would have been Paul Tillich. And then next to him would be like Karl Barth, who sort of like waffled in terms of not waffling as in like he's very clear and he's very precise, but there's a point in time where he sort of pulls back a little bit from his political activism and kind of presses more into like the Word of God. And then as you're moving kind of towards the right, you have, and I don't mean like political right, kind of I do, but I mean like active wise. Most active is Paul Tillich. Next is Karl Barth. In the middle is Friedrich Gogarten. To the right of him is someone like Emanuel Hirsch, and then you have someone like Rudolf Bultmann, who's apolitical. And so where you have Tillich is very much on the ground. He served as a chaplain in World War I. He was in confrontation with the rising Nazi power and was shipped off in 1933, I believe, to Union and the States because people were trying to preserve him. So he taught at Union. And he is a very prolific writer. So that's where we're finding Tillich. This is someone who has seen warfare up close and personal and someone who witnessed the rise and fall of Weimar Germany and Hitler's ascendancy into power. So he's worth listening to when it comes to what does it mean to do theology kind of on the ground. And I'm going to now, I'm just going to read something right before I hand it over to John Mark because I feel like this will give us a good background. This is from Paul Tillich's
Religious situation.
The religious situation, and it's the introduction, and it's written by someone by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. If you know American Protestant theology, Reinhold Niebuhr is coming out of that Union group, right, John? Right, John Mark? Like he's out
Yeah.
of that.
He invited Tillich over to teach at Union.
Yeah, and he's influential on like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and like there's a big mix going on there. All right, so I'm just going to read this little portion from the introduction to Religious Situation. Religion for Tillich is direction toward the unconditioned. It is the reference in all life to the ultimate source of meaning and the ultimate ground of being. This ultimate transcends experience and knowledge, though it is that to which all experience and knowledge refer. It is apprehended only indirectly through the symbols of the finite world. Nothing temporal, nothing finite, no one object among other objects, or no one value among other values can be designated as the ultimate. It is always transcendent and therefore unknown. Yet the reference to it is implicit in life, and wherever there is any meaning, this reference to an ultimate source of meaning is present. The religious reference may be present in culture, in art, science, politics, education, and the economic life, but in these spheres, it does not become explicit. It is taken for granted. It is an unacknowledged presupposition. In religion, in the narrowest sense of that term, the reference to the unconditioned becomes explicit. Since the unconditioned is forever hidden, transcendent, and unknowable, it follows that all religious ideas are symbolical. They are good symbols when they point unambiguously to the transcendent. They become false symbols when they are regarded as possessing an intrinsic meaning or when they claim absolute value for themselves. A beliefful realism is first of all an attitude in which the reference to the transcendent and eternal source of meaning and ground of being is present. This reference has been absent from capitalist society with its reliance on intra-worldly, intra-temporal sources of meaning, its exaltation of the finite into an absolute. I will supply that quote to you in an email so you have it and you can reread it, okay? But for now, I'm going to hand it over to John Mark. It's yours.
Also read the book. There's a lot to unpack there just in that quote, right, guys? Ralph has the book actually that I'm going to be referencing for the first part of this. It's called Dynamics of Faith. It's probably the book I would say is the best introduction to the way that Paul Tillich kind of forms a lot of his theology. But let's talk about some of those words that Lauren mentioned, the unconditioned, right, or the ultimate. Human beings have a lot of different, what I would say, they're concerned with a lot of things, primary concerns like food and shelter, clothing, right, warmth, security, physical security. But human beings, in contrast to other living beings, we have spiritual concerns, cognitive, aesthetic, way things look, social concerns, political, and some of these can feel very urgent, often extremely urgent, and each of them, as well as our vital concerns, what we need to stay alive, can claim ultimacy for a human life or the life of a social group if we're talking about a church or a political party or something like that. So the summary of ultimate concern that we're going to kind of unpack here is that faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. The content matters infinitely for the life of the individual, but it does not matter for the formal definition of faith. So we're kind of unpack how something can kind of take ultimacy in our lives and what that means. Do you guys have any questions before I go on with that? No? I have a question for you guys. Do you have anything that you can think about that is a huge concern in your life that you kind of make decisions around the way that you live or anything like that?
Can you rephrase that?
Yeah. So do you have something that takes kind of like the center stage, I guess, of how you choose to live your life or what you do in day-to-day interactions, what you kind of aim towards? Do you have a concern that you put above other things, other situations?
I think for me, it's loving kindness and receiving that and projecting that, and with that, maintaining a state of equanimity.
Sure.
In interactions.
Does anybody else have a concern that kind of drives their life? How they interact with the world? Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I think for me, it's reflecting the joy that is in the world and my heart, my God seed.
Okay.
Reflecting that in any place that I go.
Beautiful. And anybody else?
I think for me, it would be, I need to be able, when I get up in the morning and look in the mirror, I need to be comfortable with and like what I see.
Okay.
Based on my actions, behaviors and so on.
Yeah.
And my interactions with others.
Sure. Absolutely. Those are all, what I find really interesting is that these are all based on quality, which I think is really important and we'll kind of unpack as we go. But I want you guys to kind of keep those things in mind because we're going to kind of unpack this as we go too. So part of ultimate concern is demand. Whatever claims ultimacy claims the subjection of everything else within your life. So we're going to kind of talk about a case study that Tillich covers in the Dynamics of Faith. It's nationalism. But demand is the total surrender of whoever accepts the claim that is ultimate. In the case of nationalism, if a group makes the life and growth of the nation as ultimate, it demands that all other concerns, everything else, economic, well-being, health and life, family, friends, aesthetic and cognitive truth, justice, and even humanity be sacrificed. So everything in the state of for the nation can be sacrificed for this God of the nation. The extreme nationalisms of Tillich's century, we think about Nazi Germany and things like that, they were willing to sacrifice all sorts of things. They were willing to sacrifice international relationships. They were clearly willing to sacrifice the lives of Jewish people and other people and create kind of a division, right? So they sacrificed those social relationships. Propaganda was really big. So they sacrificed a lot of truth to form a narrative that they wanted to do to kind of control people. And then they clearly sacrificed this idea of what we would commonly think of as justice, because clearly the treatment of the Jewish people is incredibly unjust. And it was to kind of raise other people above.
We
And
need to remember that it wasn't just the Jews, though. It was also even people of their own race, quote unquote,
sure,
who were disabled or handicapped in any way,
yeah,
mentally had mental illness. It was the Romanis. There were an awful, we hear more about the Jews because there
Sure.
were more of them, but we can't forget the other groups as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that we need to see is that they were sacrificing some sort of homogeneity, a homogenous situation, this kind of unified acceptance, because all of a sudden when you other somebody else, you can elevate or lessen a group of people. But everything is sacrificed. The idea of this idea of making Germany great again, making it better, and showing how the superiority of Germany and German people over other people. So when everything else is sacrificed, even the smallest concerns of your daily life are kind of oriented around this concern. The only God that's there is the nation. That is the God of nationalism. That is what you make your sacrifices. That's how you aim your life. And so that object, which we'll see is demonic or self-serving or does not offer full reward, becomes the way for people to center their lives around. So that's kind of like one idea of that. Can you guys think of any other examples of nationalism, either in recent history or the past, or some sort of other self-serving relationship where we have lost or done things at great cost of relationships and socioeconomic status and things like that?
I would suspect the United States has a history of nationalism at times. And I would think that when it was the strongest, perhaps some harm was done, in the world and with other countries and other peoples. So, in fact, I was kind of curious what your take on the current is there a nationalistic spirit in this country right now, or is it ebbs and flows? Would you not agree with that?
I would say ebbs and flows. I would say that there's a tension between, say, the current administration and the former administration, where we saw definitely this idea of nationalism at the cost of socioeconomic relationships with other countries, at the cost of, say, pulling out the Paris Climate Accords for a transcendent concern, right, for the greater world, so that we can pour more resources into our country specifically, at the cost of welcoming the refugee, because we want to save resources for the people who are already here, even though people are truly being hurt. So yeah, there's definitely, you're right, it ebbs and flows. A lot of that has to do with leadership. I think right now in history, we're at a very much more polarized point where we express, we normally think of two sides of a coin when we should be giving space to like 50 sides of a coin. But it's definitely, there's a lot of identity that drives the way that people live their lives and the decisions they make and how they treat other people, 120%.
Mark, Ralph here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Civil War is probably the prime example where this country just threw everything to the wind and said, we're going to go at each other.
Yeah.
You know, and they drug in Europeans on different sides. Families were split in half. You know, brutal death, that type of thing. So, you know, that was the case where it was, you know, you're all in or you're all out.
Yeah. And we see we see in the Bible, right? Like, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, to turn us against each other, to express this ultimate concern and realize that if you are living in such a way that does not line up with my, say, transcendent concern for the well-being of everybody, then it's okay to cut you off. It's okay to call you out on that, right? Those are, like, there are lots of examples. I think we'll actually talk about this a little bit. There are tons of examples of this in the Hebrew Bible, where they kind of see this demand, threat, and promise cycle and how it kind of plays out in their life. Does anybody else have any questions before we move on to the concepts of threat and promise or anything like that?
I think the other place we can look is when you have basically two groups of people that roughly have the same history, calling upon the same God as being on their side. And therefore we stand right and you stand wrong, and you are the deviant worshipers and
So,
we are righteous worshipers.
Do you think that's because they're calling on a different God?
No, they're calling on the same God. Their belief systems are
They're
warped lenses.
Yeah, they're using the same name, I would say. So I think that a lot of this has the idea how we kind of interpret what we consider to be ultimate or transcendent. One thing that is mentioned more or less in the quote that Lauren shared before we got on is the Protestant principle. The Protestant principle to Tillich is that we don't hold anything created by finite beings to the level of infinite. That's a powerful sentiment. We don't, anything that's created by finite beings, we do not look at and revere as infinite.
Hey,
One
John
of the
Mark,
more interesting examples of that was I read a story about an SS officer with a concentration camp, and on his belt buckle it says, "In God we trust."
Yeah.
Can you imagine
Yeah.
that?
I can. I don't have to imagine it. We see that every day, right? What did you have a question or comment, Lauren?
oh, yeah, I just wanted to know, like, when we start getting into tricky water, like my rights, specifically, I'm thinking my right to have guns.
Yeah.
Where does that begin to fall into this nationalism? And then the obsession with rights almost removes it from this eternal idea. Like, I have some rights, but they're still, when they become idolatrous, they become violent, right?
Yeah. There's a destructive element.
Guns is actually really interesting in regards to that malignant understanding of rights and liberty.
That's interesting distinction right there. So I was actually talking with our friend Scott and a couple other people at his birthday, and we were talking about the differences between rights and liberty. And we kind of tried to break those down because I would say that most of us kind of use those synonymously. As a group, we decided that liberties are basically rights that you fought for. We have like the International Declaration of Human Rights, right? The idea of, you know, basically having our basic needs met and thing. Then there are liberties, liberation. There's the tie to that word, to that action there. Things like guns, or other polarizing things, like there are much more people concerned, I think, with we should all have rights to our guns and weapons versus, say, we should all have right to healthcare. I think there's a weird dichotomy there. One is life-giving and supporting. One is defensive and possibly life-threatening. That's interesting, right? Because when we think about our social situation and how we could kind of alleviate the things that we find problematic, like violence and robbery and theft and murder and all these other things, we have to understand a lot of those things come from a place of lack, a place of want. And so when you start to meet people's needs, mentally, physically, spiritually, socioeconomically, help kind of create equity instead of equality, we can people become naturally less violent. Like, absolutely. There's this when the threat of non-existence is less prevalent in someone's life, they're not going to fight to preserve their non-existence in such a violent way anymore, if that makes sense.
On some level, it does make sense, but what I'm seeing an awful lot in society today is my rights. I don't care about your rights as long as mine aren't infringed on.
Right, and so there's a lack.
That's a different. There's a lack of awareness of our rights versus mine and yours.
There's also a perceived threat. That is the issue, I think. There's a perceived threat that you will force me to do something that I don't want to do. And it's interesting because it's more based in ego than, say, the well-being of the greater community. Like a lot of masks are very othering right now. There's a huge division across this country: pro-mask, non-mask, 6 feet, not 6 feet, listen to science, don't listen to science. Science is full of it. Science has the right answers. And what's interesting is that there are people who I would say have a less idolatrous ultimate concern in this regard, or concern in this regard, not ultimate per se, maybe ultimate. It definitely pertains to all of our existence right now, where they see, like, for example, I live in such a way so that people around me have a less chance of getting sick, because I know even if I'm vaccinated, I can carry this illness. I may be asymptomatic and come into contact with my mom and dad, who are much older than me and not in the best of health. And I live in such a way that everyone I interact with is my mom and dad. That's how I center myself. But I also understand that if my mom gets sick with her pre-existing conditions, everything she has going on, she could die very easily, right? And there are cases all around. Yeah, go ahead, Ralph.
I want to contest the point that you made
Yeah.
about the guns and healthcare system. I mean, we were just talking about Germany and how they moved out of that inter-World War I-II period. And, Hitler directed the society so his group stood on top, and that threat that they felt from the armistice was essentially abolished. So you would assume that once he and his country were secure, they'd stop.
The threshold changes, right? The goalpost move.
Right. And, so they pick up a gun and turn to a peaceful group, France, Poland, you name it, and say, we're coming. We don't care about you. We don't care about your health system. We don't care that you make good wine. We're coming. And what's supposed to be the response by the Frenchman or the Dutchman or whatever? To lie there and take it?
No, Andre, I would never say that. No, I wouldn't say lie there and take it. I would say that the reason that Germany felt the need to do something like that is because they were going to get checked by countries all around them. So when you see, it's like if someone in this group was all, say, bullying on you, Ralph, and we just sit there and just go ahead, go off, have a great time. That wouldn't be right. I would hope that as the people around you seeing you get picked on, would go around and be like, hey, maybe you need to take a step back and take a look at yourself as opposed to going at Ralph. Maybe we need to address our own concerns and not push our insecurities and our ill-being upon other people. Because when the goalposts move, I don't think for a second it was that Germany's like, oh, we don't care about you. It's like, oh, you are a potential threat. Look at what we just did, and that there's not going to be any reaction. So we better keep going as far as we can and push it as far as we can. And then because we're afraid of the allies there, we band up with other groups of people who have similar ideas and want to consolidate more power. So yeah, all of that is to say, because I don't have a whole lot of time here, we got a little bit more to cover, is that there are definitely ways that concerns that we might take for granted, like political, societal, religious, things like that, that definitely shape the way that we live our lives and create action within the society. But I really need to move on to threat and promise. But I appreciate all the feedback, guys. So it's not only the unconditional demand, which makes something ultimate, but there's also the promise of ultimate fulfillment, which is accepted in the act of faith. It can be expressed in a different indefinite symbols or concrete symbols. So we're going to refer back to Germany because that's Tillich's context, where the greatness of one's nation, or perhaps the conquest of mankind by the saving race. So we have like the Aryans, or Alexander tried to do the same thing, tried to unite all of the world under Alexandria, right? But in each of these cases, the ultimate fulfillment that is promised and the exclusion of having that fulfillment is the threat in the unconditional demand if it's not obeyed. So this is, I think, so I'm going to quote part of this. We're going to come back to this a little bit, but Tillich quotes Deuteronomy 6:5, which is that you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all your soul and with all your might, with your entire being. So he stops there and he says, this is what ultimate concern means. And from these words, the term ultimate concern is derived. The state unambiguously, they state that unambiguously the character of genuine faith, the demand of total surrender to the subject of ultimate concern. And he goes on to say that the God of the Hebrew Bible, so this is interesting. He says the God of the Hebrew Bible is a state of being ultimately and unconditionally concerned about Yahweh and about what he represents in demand, threat, and promise. And for he states that the Jews see God, this God is the God of justice, not just for the Jewish people, but for all people in every nation and every time. And so they base their lives. You can look at Proverbs, right? You can look at the different books of wisdom like Ecclesiastes and the history they kind of go through as far as kings and the fall and rise of empire. They show what happens if justice is not kind of lived for. And you see not only them at the top of this, but also at the bottom of this, all the way to like Lamentations, right? Where people are crying out, God, where are you? We were your chosen people, and now you're just gone. But we also did a lot of crappy things to a lot of people. And so there's not that kind of reward that they're looking for. One more case study here is success. Especially in Western culture, success is really a big deal. Even if it's at the price and the sacrifice of genuine human relationship, personal conviction, and creativity. Its threat is social and economic defeat, and its promise is indefinite as all such promises, the fulfillment of one's own being. But when we think about success, and again, we're going to talk about the goalpost moving here, right? When we become successful or hit our money goal or our comfort level goal, the reward of that moment is only passing. It's not fulfilling to have everything that you've always wanted. Did any of you grow up on the Twilight Zone? Yeah? Any of you? I have one of my favorite episodes of the Twilight Zone is that there's this gambler and he dies and he goes to heaven. And while he's there, there are all these casinos they could possibly want to play at. And every time he plays, he wins. Every single time, no matter what game, no matter how long, every time he plays, he wins. And every woman that he's attracted to will not tell him no. And so he at the end of the episode, he goes up to God and he's like, God, so like, this is awesome. Like, I have all the money and all the women I could ever want. I have the nicest car. But look, I win. I always win. I can't lose. So the rush of gambling for me, God, is gone. And I thought I'd be different, in heaven. And God looks at me and goes, what made you think that you were in heaven? Like, what made you think that? So this guy realizes that it's not the money that he wants or the power, right? It's the journey, the fact that he can lose. So even he's successful now. He's got everything he's ever wanted. He's not fulfilled. And I think that's incredibly powerful. So like the idea of this kind of threat and promise, when you think about those kind of concerns we were talking about earlier, can you guys think of ways like of what happens if you do not attend to those kind of happens, or is there an ultimate fulfillment in them? And if not, how far can we go with that? A couple of you guys had one. I'll talk on I would say my family is probably my primary concern. I wouldn't say that they're an ultimate concern because my family's not going to offer ultimate fulfillment. If any of us have children or brothers and sisters or parents, we know that there's not always ultimate fulfillment no matter how we play the game. We can do the very best we can for our children, for example, and they can say the most horrible things to us whenever we act out of love, and that's not ultimately fulfilling. In my greater life, I do a lot of work with food disparity in the homeless community in the Lansing area. That is fulfilling to me, and in ways that, say, taking care of my family are not fulfilling. And I try to orient myself in a way that's practical, which is one of the reasons I love Paul Tillich, because he's a boots on the ground type of guy. He starts with humanity instead of moving to God. And so I think it's incredibly awesome. But we have to realize a lot of our concerns are not ultimate, and that's okay. Before we go, I have a couple more things that I want to talk about. Lauren, do we need to take a break? Is it that time?
Yeah, but if we break, I want to move into my outline.
Okay.
You can maybe try to just wrap it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, I'll do that. One thing I want to talk about real quick is that Tillich stops at Deuteronomy 6:5. I think he should go on to 9. So he talks about you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. But he goes on to say, keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart, recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home, when you are away, when you lie down, when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. He wants you to live whatever that ultimate concern is. I wrote a brief parable about that. I'll do that before we go. There's a lot more to cover, but we spent a lot of time other places. That's okay. Years ago, I wrote a parable about ultimate concern and finding your faith. Let me go here. All right. So every morning, Paul, a wealthy lawyer, would get up in the morning, thank God for all he had, and then go for a run. On this particular morning, he is jogging when he sees a homeless man begging for food. He asks God to make sure that the man gets something to eat. The next day, the same routine, and again sees the homeless man who is looking a bit hungrier, and asks God to please make sure he gets something to eat. The next day he gets up, says thanks to God for all that he has, and he goes for his jog, but again he sees the homeless man who looks exhausted, and then that man falls over. Paul calls 911 and gets the ambulance with this person, making sure he's okay. He has suffered from malnutrition and dehydration. While he's at the hospital, he curses God and denounces his faith. If God will not help this homeless man and the hungry, he would. He actually did that. He took Joseph in, he had learned his name, when he got out of the hospital. He helped him get on his feet, get food, housing, helped him find a job, and something clicked. He quit working as an incredibly successful practice and he started a nonprofit. He made sure to help find people a place to stay and have something to eat. He helped people to get jobs. He worked with other service programs in the local area to help better meet all of the needs of all sorts of people. He even decided to run for city council so he could help have a more direct impact on some of the policies that were put in place. When God saw this, he looked down upon Paul and smiled. Paul had finally found his faith. He denounced God and gave up the way he was brought up for an ultimate concern of a transcendent concern for humanity. He gave up the comfort and excess that he had. He sold all his possessions and decided to follow Jesus, is basically how I look at it. But the point is that it's the way of living. Ultimate concern isn't what we say, it's how we live in our very centered act of our being in our day-to-day lives. And that can look different to everybody. At the beginning, it says that the content of ultimate concern is only important to the person, but it's not important to the definition of faith.
All right. That is really awesome because it's going to bleed really well into talking about religion from the perspective of the toxicity of religion and the tonicity of religion, and how our ultimate concerns that we hold will impact how we're both toxic and tonic in the world. So why don't we take a break? And if you have any questions for John Mark when you come back, we can write them down we can type them up in the chat. You can whisper them to me at another point in time. But I'm really grateful for having this other dynamic aspect of the discussion about religion in place for tonight, because I think it's going to make our second half super fun. So
yeah, if you guys have questions about Tillich, you can put them in this chat box. I'll respond to them all and then send them to Lauren and she can blast them all out for everybody.
yeah, and I did email you. I was taking notes in a colorful fashion over here. I took a picture of it. I sent it to you on email so you can see just a little snapshot of the stuff I was pulling down from what John Mark was looking at so that you guys have something concrete. So anyway, for now, let's take a break and we'll come back in about 5.
I've read it. I've never seen it. It's good though.
Hey, Lauren, it's Susan. Can you hear me?
Hi, Susan.
Hi. Quick question, not related to class at all, but Brian wants to know if the heat is working in the
No,
building. No?
it's working. Oh, it's cold in here, but I'm fine with it.
Okay, because he went up today and actually the guys were there that were supposed to do some work on it. So
Okay.
it should be working.
Daniel says he thinks it's working.
Okay, all right. Great. Brian's joining us from about 20 feet away in the other room where he's keeping his sore throat and other symptoms to himself. So we're awaiting the results of our PCR tests that we had on Tuesday.
No, they did those. There is, strep is going around.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff going around.
I like to say stress is going around too.
You like to say what is? Stress, exactly. I like the picture of the doors with the blue.
The lift is, like, the door to the lift is in, so we're doing good.
That's
Wow.
great.
David, were you gonna say something?
I just said that's good. That sounds like real progress taking place. That's cool.
Good stuff. All right, so it's been about 5 minutes, so I'm sure people will start hearing me yammering. One that I really like about what John Mark was explaining on behalf of Tillich was this idea of the ultimate concern and how that relates to this immaterial thing that has a real presence in our lives. And in this way, we can start to have language of talking about religion, talking about faith. And one of the things that I'm always cautious about is never ascribing, when we talk about all religions, not all religions have a faithful aspect. Not all religions talk about faith as being like a primary thing, but when you start to look at the rudimentary aspects of all traditions, they do have an ultimate concern. And that is really powerful because it gives us really good language to address our pre-understanding that religion equals faith. And it does for us in a very profound way, but that's not necessarily what it is for all people in all different traditions across the world. So the idea of ultimate concern is really nice because it gives us language to use that's flexible and pliable as we go about with dialogues with other people, right? And that's really, really important. So one thing that I wanted to do was, when looking at the bad and the good of religion, one of the things that I always like to be very aware of is that people reject religion because of the bad things. So maybe some of the misunderstanding or misinterpretation, maybe I can't even say that, but some people have ultimate concerns that in Christianity, some people have ultimate concerns that are not, to me, the ultimate concerns. Okay? And so when we have the language of ultimate concern, we can say, when someone comes to us and talks to us about the toxicity of religion, or specifically in our context, the toxicity of Christianity, we can hear what they're articulating, that they have been impacted by someone else's ultimate concern that has ended in violence. So John Mark gave us the example. I went to my board, but there's nothing on it. Anyway, John Mark gave us the example of nationalism and how it can become this divine entity nearly in the life of a person of a country, to the point where it becomes the thing to which you will sacrifice everything. It is the demand that demands total conformity, and this becomes problematic. And we have the same thing operating within religions in general. It's where we get our extremist factions. Okay, and so what I wanted to do was just briefly, from Dynamics of Faith, I wanted to, and I'll provide you with this quote, and if anyone was paying attention to me at any point, you may have noticed I was pecking out a little some of the text so that I could get started on getting you those quotations right away. But this is from the end of Dynamics of Faith by Paul Tillich, and it's the possibility and necessity of faith today. Faith is real in every period of history. This fact does not prove that it is an essential possibility and necessity. It could be, like superstition, an actual distortion of humanity's true nature. This is what many people who reject faith believe. The question raised by this book is whether such belief is based on insight or on misunderstanding, and the answer is unambiguously that the rejection of faith is rooted in a complete misunderstanding of the nature of faith. Many forms of this misunderstanding, many misrepresentations and distortions of faith have been discussed. Faith is a concept and a reality which is difficult to grasp and to describe. Almost every word by which faith has been described is open to new misinterpretations. This cannot be otherwise, since faith is not a phenomenon beside others, but the central phenomenon in humanity's personal life, manifest and hidden at the same time. It is religious and transcends religion. It is universal and concrete. It is infinitely variable and always the same. Faith is an essential possibility of humanity, and therefore its existence is necessary and universal. It is possible and necessary also in our period. If faith is understood as what it centrally is, ultimate concern, it cannot be undercut by modern science or any kind of philosophy, and it cannot be discredited by its superstitions or authoritarian distortions within and with outside churches, sects, and movements. Faith stands upon itself and justifies itself against those who attack it, because they can attack it only in the name of another faith. It is the triumph of the dynamics of faith that any denial of faith is itself an expression of faith, of an ultimate concern. Okay, and this is one of the arguments that we can get into if we wanted to about whether or not atheism itself is a religion, because it does actually have an ultimate concern. And so we can start to have fun with that. But for now, this idea of misunderstanding of faith, or maybe misunderstanding of religion, or the misunderstanding of the ultimate concern, is where I wanted to head, because it really does get at the heart of where we find toxicity in religion. And it saddens me that there is toxicity in religion, because my ultimate concern would lead me to say that there's so much beauty, and there's so much love, and there's community, and there's belonging in religion. Religion demands of me something that is outside of myself, that I am not the only thing that matters, that I am not the, center of all that is. And yet I see religion used in a way that is so violent. And violence becomes one of the most toxic things about religion. Okay? Why do you think religion and violence tend to go hand in hand? And we're not talking just strictly, the monotheistic traditions are so violent. We've got violence in the militant factions of the warrior caste of Hinduism. We've got violence in Buddhism. I mean, the very thing that has been upheld in the West as like kind of the most transcendent, personally selflessly transcendent religion, Buddhism, has its own violences. We could start to press into Sikhism. It has its orientation towards violence as well, which it shouldn't if you read its rubrics. But what about you? What's your experience with the correlation between religion and violence? And have you ever encountered anyone that's like, I hate the whole thing, it's all violent?
Violence happens when we can no longer have a conversation.
Yeah.
When we can no longer talk about our disagreements or our competing needs, violence is the answer. I would say historically.
Yeah.
I think for me, thinking about it, the violence happens when fear prevails and overtakes all other human emotion and intellect, and becomes the context.
Mhm. Yeah.
Violence tends to happen when you feel like you don't have another choice.
Violence also happens when what you hold as core beliefs for you are challenged by someone else. Those core beliefs. I'm right, period, end of discussion is,
I believe balance can also take place when people have misdirected ideas and concepts of God, that their God is supreme, all powerful, and strong, and God will sanction anything to bring about God's will and God's purpose and God's plan. It's all a matter of perception. This is a take I have on it.
Was it in Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart? He says he finds it interesting that the Ibu man's God wants whatever the Ibu man wants.
Yeah, well, and there's really the idea of violence. Like if we look back, people have done violence in the name of God or in the name of their tradition, and then they've done it. They've done violence in defense of their tradition and their belief systems and themselves, and then they've participated in violence where violence is stemming out of fear. So think about the heavy emphasis in the Middle Ages in regards to the really living, breathing fear of hell that was very, very much a real thing in medieval theology. You desperately wanted to save people from that. You might get a little violent in regards to, like, you need to believe this right now because otherwise you're going to be in eternal hellfires forever. There's so many different factions or factors that sort of influence our understanding of the toxicity of religion that manifests as violence. Okay, let's look at our own country. Civil war, okay, and even broadly larger, 47% of civil wars occurring in the world have been religious, even the one that was on our own lands. Which is an interesting one because it also simultaneously highlights one of the tonics of religion, because there was a religious debate on the field, and that was the sanctity of life, okay? And that was whether or not God was ordaining slavery or whether we were reading it wrong, right? When we have the abolitionist movement paired alongside the theologians and the pastors who are arguing for slavery as a means by which God was working out the salvation for African Americans, people that we took out of Africa and brought here to serve as slaves. There was a religious argument going on between two claims to God. Okay, abolition movements, a lot of them in England and here, come out of a very robust understanding of divine love for humanity, no matter what the skin. And so simultaneously, as we look at the violence of war done or the violence of oppression that can come in with religion, we simultaneously see people saying, that's not how I see it, and so I'm going to fight for this other interpretation. Yeah, Marty, go ahead.
And the part of the thing of that is our own interpretation of God. Each of us as individuals and as a community try to put God into a box that our brains can comprehend. For example, if you want to go back to the issue of slavery, the God I know and love and try to serve today, well, we won't get into time frames, loves all of humanity. It doesn't matter skin color, hair color, ability, disability, what language you speak, whether you can read and are highly literate and educated, or never opened a book or seen a book in your life. God isn't limited, and we try to, because we are human and need to have limits to cope, to fit our understanding.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good idea, is that we do tend to want to hammer God down into a very specific form. One of the things that I have been doing over the past couple of years is reading Black liberation theology and noticing how the claims on God, as Marty highlighted, in terms of boxing God into a very specific conception of God, these ideas were at play or have been at play for a long time in our own country in regards to how we speak about God. Is God a white man, or is God disembodied? Is Jesus, how many of us have been raised with images of Jesus being practically blonde hair and blue-eyed, right? Where that would not have done well for a Middle Eastern man in a lot of sun, so we know that he was brown-skinned, and we know that he had dark hair and dark eyes. But we tend to want to stake a claim on God, as Marty was saying, and make God look just like us so that we can justify whatever it is that we want in terms of our power and privilege, and simultaneously say, well, you differ, and so this can't be, you can't be part of this equation. Okay, when we get into language, really interesting language is sitting on a hill language. And we have that really rippling through a lot of the political rhetoric, even in 2021. We like to claim that we're beyond religion. We are beyond God, but we are not, because there is no one who would ever run with a sensible mind that wouldn't use religious rhetoric in their political speeches. But we have going on, I see it on Twitter, okay? I'm on Twitter, and theologians shouldn't be on Twitter anymore because politicians get in and they start saying things like, God has called two peoples, Israel and America. And I go, I just start twitching because I'm like, wait, no, we're not the new Israel. But
It used to be a beautiful place.
there's a tendency to want to, with our ultimate concerns in play, if nationalism is your ultimate concern, if being an American and being great is an ultimate concern, that ultimate concern, like John Mark explained, is going to replace God, and you're going to start filling that God spot with everything that reflects that ultimate concern. And it's going to start to anyone who comes against that and says, my Jesus is black, and you're going to go, what? And no, because that's a threat, because I've staked everything on this claim. I have sacrificed everything. And now there's an external threat that is going to potentially refuse me my promise of being this chosen person in the city on the hill, right? You see how this is all linked together, and we get violent. We have seen violence in the past few years, and there is a strong component of religiosity that's fueling some of those violent tendencies that are coming out. So it's more than just violence between religions. It's violence in how we see ourselves in relationship with God and whom we've claimed God to be. Okay, the stronger the claim on God, the more violent the response when anything comes up against it. Marty, go ahead.
It also violence has to do with our view of ourselves in relationship to other people. And to be honest, not just people, but all of creation. If we don't take, for example, if we're not aware of the need to take responsibility for clean water, for maintaining forests and grasslands and all these species that people say are irrelevant now, but we find out 10 years down the road, gee whiz, we missed that because this link is now missing. But and basically what I'm getting into is creation theology. We are all one.
Yes.
We come from the same source, and we are called back to that source.
Yeah.
Whatever name you want to give that source. For me, I call it God and Christ.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be the same name for anyone else, but the ultimate goal of all of us doing well has to be there.
That reminds me of religious humanism, right? Or
More creationism.
no, bear with me. So religious humanism is the idea that there's not going to be this Deus ex machina that comes down. There's not going to be a divine event that changes our water, right? Or gets rid of global warming. It's this idea that we have to be active for that change. We have to be in Christianity, we might think about we have to build the kingdom of heaven brick by brick. We have to walk into hell and alleviate that darkness for our brother and sister. We have to be the people who create the social, economic, and spiritual change that better the world around us. If we sit here and just wait for that event, we might be waiting for a long time, and it only gets worse. So if we can create a counter narrative now, and see those issues, we can start correcting those things. We can start making strides. We can start saving those species that we find out 10 years later that really mattered now.
It goes back in many ways to what you talked about, and you said the homily you wrote about this lawyer or whatever he did.
Yeah.
It also goes back to Matthew 25. What are we going to be judged on? He doesn't say we're going to be judged on how many Dior outfits we had, or how many pairs of shoes, or Apple phones, or
Lauren.
Sorry, Lauren. but we're going to be judged on, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you give drink to the thirsty? Did you welcome the stranger? Those are all tied into the same thing. And one of the things that I've been getting through a spiritual direction program I'm participating in is how to connect with, and I mean really connect with other creatures on their level, meeting their needs and hearing their response to mine.
I love that. I really love that. Moving through some other ideas of why violence and religion are connected, and this gets us, it's the animal statements connecting with nature that's important, because we have religions historically, a good number of religions had a strong sacrificial component. Okay.
And a strong what?
Sacrificial component in terms of animal sacrifices, which sort of put humanity in not necessarily in opposition with animal kind, but animal kind was a means by which the gods were appeased. Okay,
was a tool.
This in sort of like the pre-Vedic and Vedic tradition of Hinduism, we see sacrificial rites to Indras and the other two pre-Vedic gods, but the god of fire and the god of war and weather. And then we have in Judaism, which Christianity is born out of, we also have a sacrificial system, and there's sacrificial systems in other areas. So religion has this weird relationship with violence, specifically creation violence, that has been used to appease the gods. And so historically, a lot of traditions have tried to walk away from that. Specifically for us, interestingly, is we have the cross event, which again is a very heated, violent event depending on what's going on, and we can talk about that at another time. But we also have when the second temple is destroyed, and in the process of the second temple being destroyed, the rabbis have to start moving Israel into a period of a non-sacrificial Israel. And so they become the people of the book. And so with a bunch of different movements in regards to the inability to sacrifice, and then what does this mean for my relationship with God? If this God is angry at me and killing this animal and spilling its blood and burning its fat and, burning its meat actually makes this God happy with me, what do I do now that I can't do that? And is there another way for us to start talking about that sacrificial component? And so you see a movement in regards to the self being sacrificed, which again plays a big part in a lot of oppression coming from religion towards people of oppressed groups. And Christianity is culprit in this, held captive and culprit in regards to asking people who are, as John Mark was talking, he was talking about just now, and Marty was talking about how we need to fight on behalf of the others who don't have a voice or aren't able to fight for themselves. We need to be advocates for both, land and animal, as well as people who are in groups that are being oppressed. And one thing that religion has done historically is glorify that self-sacrifice into suffering so that the person doesn't fight for their livelihood, and thereby religion participates in the oppression of people by stripping them of their rights to fight for a better existence. It's sort of disarming them. Meanwhile, me, who's part of the powerful, or not the powerful, but the privileged group, the dominant group, I get to live my best life now because it's super easy as a heterosexual white woman to do that in many regards. But it's not for me to then use that privilege to oppress people and say, well, your time will come in heaven when you can have everything you've ever wanted. But for now, just suffer for the name of the Lord. It's the same sacrificial violence from previously. It's just now really personal, and it's very, very, very destructive. And so the church itself and religion, I think in general, needs to make motions to watch the language of glorification of suffering, because it's just new sacrificial language, which is inherent in traditions, to sacrifice oneself. Another aspect of violence is extremism and fundamentalism. These two things tend to be very, very violent because, again, as Marty pointed out, it's a stronghold on God. It is you're going to color, it's a color by number, and there's one color. And you don't get to do anything else. And so it's a very narrow way that and it's done with a lot of fear. So I always like to have a lot of compassion for understanding humanity in extremism and fundamentalism. I don't condone it. I don't try to support it. I do understand that human beings are fractured and stuck, and they get controlled through fear. And sometimes in the extremist and fundamentalist branches of religion, what you have controlling people is fear. Okay? Fear of punishment, fear of death, fear of being ousted from the group, fear of loss of identity, fear of home, fear of family. We have human beings in Christianity that are scared to tell family members who they are for fear of being thrown out because of religion. And that is horrible because we have suicide rates that are astronomical in certain groups of people. Faith and belief can also be used for tools of oppression, which is what I said. So that's the bad. Okay, I'm leading with the bad so I can end on the good. But when we look at the good, we have things like abolitionism, civil rights, humanities, music. Think about Bach and Beethoven, and think about all the art that is influenced by religious and spiritual desire. Literature, stuff that's been written that's trying to articulate the bigger pictures of life. Faith and belief fuels power of the people. Think civil rights movement, right? Think about people who endlessly fight to try to get better gun control in our country. They're doing it because they love people. That's their ultimate concern, right? And so we have all these things that we fight for and that are fueled by our religious environment. If that religious environment holds to an ultimate concern that human life is absolutely precious, that all human life gets a right to not only survive, but have an opportunity for thriving, right? Like, this is so important. So when your religious environment holds to people first, that's the ultimate concern, that this was God's ultimate concern. If we actually take our scriptures seriously, God's ultimate concern is 100% human beings, the world, creation, animals. For God so loved the world, God entered it. For God so loved the world that God went to the fringes and touched the lepers and hung out with the prostitutes and stayed with sinners, and even the Holy Spirit. Once Jesus ascends, you've got the Holy Spirit descending and pushing Peter into the fringes of Cornelius's household so that he can be converted to understand that God loves all people. So when we talk about ultimate concern, we get our lead from the one who manifested, materialized, embodied God's ultimate concern. So this is where we get that tonic. Religion's not done. Faith isn't done. Spirituality isn't done. It's never done because it's not ours to claim to begin with. God's not done because God's not ours to claim. We can allow certain conceptions of God to die, and we best. If we're going to move this world forward, if we're going to move ourselves forward, if Christianity has a fighting chance in this country of actually being something that's worthy of respect, that when Christians walk onto the scene, people say, oh, damn, here come the Christians. Everyone batten down the hatches. You know, politicians shouldn't be able to guarantee our vote because we're Christian. We should be the wild card. People should shake when we walk into voting booths. Oh no, where's that Christian going to cast their vote? Oh no, right? But we should have that freedom and that liberty and that energy and that zeal for life. That we should always be known as people who don't take life, but protect it, give it, grant it, help it in all shapes and forms and sizes and colors. So even though there's tons of bad, we need to look that bad square in the eye and say, that is toxic. And I am sorry how much it has hurt people, and I know that I've been hurt by the toxicity of religion. But at the end of the day, I didn't choose my faith. I didn't choose God. God sought me. God sought the world. God sought the cosmos. And I am wrapped up in that story, and I will do my darndest to lay my life down for the people that God loves. Not for me, not for my agenda, and not for my ecclesiology or anything else. It will always be for the people. And that's why priests should lie down at their ordination. I'm out. Anyway, it is 7:58, so I've got a couple of minutes after my rant. But that is, good and bad of religion. Anyway, love you guys. But any questions? Anything to talk about?
No, I'm excited. For those interested, I put in the books that Lauren and I read from today, as well as the books that Ralph mentioned, in the chat. I think that goes directly away as soon as you guys end the meeting on your end. But if you want to take note of those real quick, I'm excited about this. And God said how translation can feel the Bible's original meaning, and then the Bible's cutting room floor. Because I find Jewish studies very interesting and rabbinic studies very interesting. So I'm excited about this.
Abraham Heschel
And which,
are excellent scholars, Jewish scholars.
Do you say Heschel?
Heschel.
Who else did you? Yeah, Joshua. Art Green too. Was a student of Heschel. He's actually the person who taught me the word religious humanist, because Heschel's a religious humanist, Buber's a religious humanist, Tillich's a religious humanist, Peter Rollin is a religious humanist / theist. And I'm excited about that movement. I like practical theology probably the most.
I think your differentiation between the evil of religion and the good of religion in some ways reflects what John Mark was talking about with nationalism. There's a difference between nationalism and patriotism.
Yes.
Patriotism says, I love my country. She has faults. I will work to make them better.
Yeah.
I will admit those faults, correct them, and work toward a better future.
Yeah.
Yep. Well said.
Non-fanatical religion does the same thing. Religion Organized religion throughout history has not been blameless. There are things we should not, as Christians, be proud of at all. But we're reaching the point where we can admit we made mistakes in God's name and grow from them.
And not be excommunicated for saying that. So, I mean, we're making good progress, I feel. So, like, that's the most important part, I think, is that people who stood up against the institution, the patriots, or I don't know what you call a religious patriot, but the people who are critiquing finite things are important people. And those are prophetic voices that we need to listen to. And so I'm incredibly grateful for those voices. For me, some of those voices are Karl Rahner and Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr.
Yes.
And,
Rahner's a favorite.
yeah, Karl Rahner is phenomenal. Karl Rahner was almost excommunicated for his work, right?
No.
Yeah, for 10
Charles
years.
Curran was.
Yeah, he couldn't teach, write, or publish for 10 years. And then they asked him to speak at Vatican II because he was a really smart guy. But yeah, I love that differentiation between patriotism and nationalism. I wish I had a religious word for that. Maybe I'll work to find one before we meet next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. It is so encouraging to see you all and makes my heart happy. So yeah,
I have a,
yeah. Maybe we can bring that up on the next time. John Mark, can you snag that for me?
I just copied it. I'm gonna paste it real quick on a sticky note that I have before we close.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much for that last edition, Kathy Lynn. We will talk about that. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your week. It is nice and cool here in Colorado. I'm guessing Michigan is also cool, so we get to wear sweaters now. Anyway, I'm excited.
Little season.
I have a question unrelated to class for David Dancy. Are you still there, David?
I'm here.
How is the surgical patient? Is he home?
Oh, thank you for asking.